is a really interesting group of plants because it feels like it has a lot of rules around it. And the only reason I think it really feels that way is because there are a lot of different types of ornamental shrubs and vines. And what I hope to do today is to kind of go through all of the major groupings of these plants and talk about some of the things that you might consider or do with each one of them. So let's just get into it. Alicia said that she wasn't sure how much of an introduction she had for me, but that was perfect. So I don't need to do any more. We'll just get started here. So we'll start by talking about why we might prune ornamental shrubs or vines. And there are a few different kind of major reasons that we would do this. One, of course, is for plant health. We want to remove any dead, dying, or diseased wood. Some diseases or insects can be pruned out or mostly pruned out. So things like scale or black knot, we can use pruning to help eliminate a lot of it. We might want to use pruning also to help thin the shrub out so that we can get better light and light penetration and air circulation, which can also help quite a bit with disease. We would also prune for training purposes to help get that shrub, especially in the first couple of years of its time in your landscape, getting started off on the right foot, getting that shrub, especially the architectural type shrubs, which I'll talk about, or framework type shrubs that I'll talk about in just a minute. It's good to get that good framework and have a good sound kind of structural form for your shrub. It will make work down the road much easier and much less frequent. There'll be less maintenance on shrubs that are well trained. Often, one of the big reasons we end up pruning shrubs in particular is because often it can really improve ornamental characteristics in a lot of different shrubs. Typically, the newer growth on shrubs has better flowering, or better fruiting, has better stem color or foliage color. And so by pruning, we can invigorate new growth that has those characteristics. And finally, we might prune to restrict growth. And many of us may accidentally fall into this category for pruning because what we purchase doesn't quite fit, what we planted doesn't quite fit where we want it to. And so we need to restrict growth in some way. The plant's too large, and so we need to scale it back, or we want to have something that's more formal. And I'll talk a lot more detail about formal hedges and those kinds of things later on. But this is another big reason many of us prune. And I do want to stress that when we're pruning to restrict growth, it is a never-ending battle. So sometimes it can get a little frustrating, but plants are going to grow the way that they're going to grow. And the best way to avoid this is to make sure that you select the right cultivar or the right variety so that you don't have to battle the size of the plant and try to restrict the growth to keep it looking the way that you need it to in your landscape. All right, so I want to go through a few of the tools and kind of talk about how we use them, which ones are good for pruning shrubs in particular. So I'll first start with pruners, hand shears, whatever you want to call them. They're good for branches that are about 3/4 of an inch or smaller. If you find yourself kind of like cranking down or like wiggling back and forth to get it to cut through, the branch is too big. You need to use a different tool. There are basically two types of pruners. There's bypass pruners that kind of work like a scissor action. They make nice clean cuts, which is good. And they don't typically crush the stem when they do that, which is also a very good thing. There are also anvil type pruners, which have a blade that kind of come down onto a cutting surface. And they can cut, or they can kind of crush stems sometimes. But they're much less likely to jam up than a bypass pruners. And they're actually really great for pruning like dead material out. So if you had to choose, if you only bought one, I would definitely buy a bypass pruners. It is much more versatile and it's going to be able to be used in nearly all settings for pruning shrubs. And really, the anvil types are going to be most useful for pruning out dead material. And of course, a lot of the pruning we do isn't necessarily dead material. So keep that in mind as you're making a purchase. Like with all of the tools that we're going to be talking about, keeping them sharp and clean is really important. Good pruners will have blades that are easily sharpened or easily replaced without replacing the whole tool, which of course is very nice. And to keep them clean, especially when we're doing things like pruning out diseased material, disinfecting them is going to be really important. For most home gardeners, rubbing alcohol is the easiest way to disinfect your pruners. Some of the other things that we might use definitely work, but they're not as convenient or as accessible as rubbing alcohol is. So I often recommend starting with that. Next one I want to talk about are loppers. There we go. Loppers are essentially long-handled shears or pruning shears. They are good for branches that are about 1.5 inches in diameter, but they do come in different sizes. So you can get some pretty hefty loppers that can cut through some pretty good sized stems. Just like with pruners, you can have bypass type or anvil type, and they have the same advantages and disadvantages. And in most situations, the bypass pruners is probably going to be a better choice because it's not going to crush stems and cause more damage. The long, large handles can give you some good leverage, making it a little easier to cut through things. It's also really nice sometimes, especially when we're pruning at the base of shrubs, like cane type shrubs. Again, I'll talk about those in just a minute. You don't have to do as much bending over because you have these nice long handles to kind of get in. You can use the long handles kind of reach in to places too, making it a little easier to get some of this pruning work done. And just like pruners, clean and sharp is important. The good ones will let you sharpen or replace the blades. The next one on my list here is the pruning saw. And if I only had to have 2 pieces of equipment for pruning just about anything in my yard, shrubs, trees, all of it, a bypass pruners and a folding pruning saw would get me like 95% of nearly everything I need to do. So if you're looking to invest in tools, those are definitely the 2 that I would start with. Pruning saws are good for anything that's too large for a pruners or a loppers. And really, you can go just about as big as you can handle, until you're tired, right? So these saws are different than the saws that you'll find in the hardware section of the store. It's not the same as a hacksaw or like a kind of a classic construction kind of saw. Most pruning saws have a long, curved, tapered blade, making it easier to kind of get into areas, especially the folding ones. You also get bow saws. I prefer folding pruning saws. They also typically have a blade that cuts on the push and the pull. So it's a lot less work to get through the branch. And when you're doing a lot of pruning, that makes a huge difference. With pruning saws, it's not practical for home gardeners to sharpen them. And so often we're just going to replace the blade. And good pruning saws will let you replace the blade without having to buy an entirely new saw. And this is going to be necessary eventually. It's really easy to break the tip off of your pruning saw. And so it'll be beneficial, it's beneficial to be able to replace the blade if that ever happens. And we do want to keep it clean and sharp, just like all the other things we've talked about. And if you're noticing that your pruning saw, it takes longer to get through branches or it kind of jams up more often, then it's probably time to replace the blade. There's also hedge shears, long flat blade, usually with shorter handles. This is not something that you would use for much more than pruning formal hedges. Hedge shears do not replace pruners, loppers, or pruning saws. And unless you're trying to maintain something like a formal hedge, it's probably not something that you need in your tool belt for pruning. I am going to talk a lot more about pruning formal hedges a little bit later, but of course, hedge shears are important for that process. There are also, of course, electric or gas-powered ones for big jobs. And just like with everything else, clean and sharp is really important. The only other tool I'd probably maybe add to this list for pruning shrubs, there are other pruning tools for trees, but for pruning shrubs, the only one you might use is a chainsaw. And for most situations, you're not going to need a chainsaw for shrubs. Really, the only time I can think of needing a chainsaw is going to be if you're removing the shrub. And so you can use it to just take everything out relatively easily. Chainsaws are a lot of maintenance. They are, if you're not operating them correctly, it can be incredibly dangerous. And so for most situations, it's not going to be needed. If you really, really, really want to use a power tool, a reciprocating saw is probably going to be more useful than a chainsaw, as long as you keep a nice sharp blade on it. That's going to be very important. But that kind of thin blade is really easy to get into different areas. The blades are easy to replace if they break or dull, and they're relatively inexpensive. So keeping a nice, clean, sharp blade on a battery or plug-in reciprocating saw can be a way to use a power tool if you really, really want to use one. So those are some of the tools we're going to talk about. I do real briefly want to talk about some terminology, kind of go through some of the terms that I'm going to be referencing for the rest of the presentation, just to be sure we're all on the same page. I'm going to be talking a lot about buds. Bud is a little protuberance. It's a little piece on the stem that may develop into a leaf, a flower, or another stem. There are different types of buds. Terminal bud is at the tip of the branch, sometimes called the apical bud. A lateral bud is along the side of the branch. And an axillary bud is at the base of the leaf, where the leaf attaches to the stem in the leaf axil. And a latent bud is a dormant bud that often we spur into growth with our pruning cuts. They're usually not very visible, but they do break and grow into a leaf, a flower, or a stem, often when we make certain types of pruning cuts. A node is going to be any spot where a leaf attaches. Internode is the spot in between nodes. And a shoot is going to be basically the current year's growth. It tends to be relatively vigorous, but if we have a really vigorous, often very upright growing shoot, we often call that a sucker. Now, some people will use those terms interchangeably, but a sucker really describes a very vigorous, usually very long, one season's worth of growth. And if it comes from the root system, it would be a root sucker. And both of these suckers tend to be things that we want to remove in shrubs because they don't often flower or fruit very well, and they can kind of take a lot of energy away from the plant. And in the case of root suckers, they can cause a lot of havoc too. And this picture here on the right, this is a witch hazel that has a nice red fall color. But this cultivar of witch hazel is grafted to a common witch hazel, which has yellow fall color. And so those yellow branches are coming from the root system. They're very vigorous. Those root suckers have the potential of taking over or dominating the named cultivar that we're trying to grow. And so removing them would be really beneficial, and being able to identify them would be really beneficial. A few other terms. Deciduous, of course, is anything that loses its leaves in the fall and regrows new ones in the spring. Evergreen is going to be anything that has leaves year-round. And I want to make a special note to point out that not all conifers are evergreen, and not all evergreens are conifers. The two are not synonymous, even though we often talk about them in that way. If I say, oh, I'm growing an evergreen, the thing that pops into your head is a pine or a spruce or something like that. And any plant that has leaves year-round can be considered an evergreen. And there are several conifers: larch, bald cypress, dawn redwood, ginkgo. These are all deciduous plants that lose their leaves in the fall and grow new ones in the spring. So don't confuse the two. There's also broadleaf evergreens. These are typically not in the gymnosperm or conifer family. We don't have a lot of broadleaf evergreens in Iowa. They typically are very stressed out by our winters, but there are a few, namely rhododendrons, some hollies, and some boxwood that we'll come across. And we'll talk about some of those later in the talk too. There's a couple of really interesting pruning techniques, in particular espalier, which is pruning a plant kind of flat against a wall or trellis, and pollarding, which is a system of pruning that trims stems back to the same point every year, and it causes vigorous regrowth at that point. And eventually this kind of knobby thing forms. The whomping willow from Harry Potter was a pollarded tree, if you're trying to think of what that might look like. So a few other terms that I'm going to be throwing around a lot that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page on. There's new growth or old growth. Sometimes I'll refer to it as new wood and old wood. New wood is going to be the current season's growth, and old wood is going to be a previous season's growth. And this is really important in shrubs because some shrubs will bloom on current season's growth, like new wood or new growth, and some shrubs are going to bloom on old growth or old wood, or those stems that formed in a previous growing season. And how we trim those and how we prune those are going to be slightly different. The only thing I'll mention is that is callus tissue on shrubs. Any pruning cut we make makes a wound on the plant. And plants cannot heal, but they can seal off or compartmentalize the damage that you create with your pruning cut. And callus tissue is that material that forms to help seal off that. And we want to make a pruning cut in such a way that promotes the formation of callus tissue so it can seal off as quickly as possible and we don't see any kind of rot. And that white circle is a pruning cut that was a pretty good one. We can see that little donut of callus tissue forming. That wound that we created with our pruning cut is getting kind of sealed off nicely. The one in the green circle, kind of up further, you'll notice doesn't have a lot of callus tissue around it. That wasn't a great pruning cut. It has not sealed off very well. And you'll notice there's some rot that has formed because of that. On shrubs, some of this stuff isn't as big of a deal. They don't get as large. And so we're not as worried about it like falling on our house or our car or somebody walking by. And often shrubs recycle. We prune shrubs in a way that kind of recycles through stems. But we always want to try to make pruning cuts in such a way so that the wound that we create forms callus tissue quickly and is able to seal it off as quickly as possible. When we talk about pruning, there are basically two types of cuts, and the way that we make these cuts spurs different types of growth. The first one I want to talk about is a heading cut, and a heading cut is basically cutting a branch back to a bud or a small lateral or side shoot. And the thing that's interesting about heading cuts is that when we make this type of pruning cut, it promotes a lot of vigorous regrowth. And so on the right-hand side there's a arrowwood viburnum that had part of the stem removed back to a bud. And you'll notice all of these new stems that kind of grew off of that spot just below that heading cut. Often heading cuts will change the form of the plant. And sometimes this is what we want. If we're trying to form a meatball as a topiary, a bunch of heading cuts are going to help us with that. But in many shrubs, and the other nice thing about heading cuts is that that proliferation of growth can really help fill out a shrub or kind of promote bushiness and fill in areas. And in some situations, that's a really positive thing. In many shrubs, when we do heading cuts, especially cane type shrubs, we get kind of kind of an imbalanced shrub. You might have like a lot of growth on top and very little in the lower on the plant. Sometimes all that regrowth gets really heavy and stems start to bend over. And sometimes it can create a really awkward looking plant. So you have to keep that in mind. When we do shearing, we're basically making tons and tons of little heading cuts. And pinching is essentially a heading cut too. It's just in reference to a very new succulent growth that you could basically remove with your fingers. But it is too just a heading cut, removing part of the stem back to a bud or a small side shoot. The other type of pruning cut that we would make is a thinning cut. And a thinning cut is essentially removing the entire branch back to its point of origin. On some shrubs, this will be the base of the shrub. Some shrubs have a lot of growth, or most or nearly all of their growth from the base. And so when we do a thinning cut, we're going to remove it all the way down to the base of the plant. On other shrubs, a thinning cut is going to be back to a parent branch of some type. While we do get regrowth, we do get latent buds that break, or even lateral or axillary buds that break when we make a thinning cut. It's not as prolific or as vigorous as we would see with a heading cut. And often when we make thinning cuts, we can easily preserve the natural form of the shrub, or at least more easily than with a heading cut. Both of these types of cuts can reduce size, changing the overall size of the plant. Both of them can help, at least initially, open up the plant. Thinning cuts are really beneficial if we're trying to thin out the shrub to get better air or light, air circulation or light penetration. for better fruiting or flowering or disease management, that kind of thing. Heading cuts can sometimes do the exact opposite because of that proliferation of growth creates a lot more little branches that wouldn't allow for light penetration or anything like that. So when we talk about pruning, we're going to do either going to cut the entire branch off at its point of origin, which is a thinning cut, or you're going to remove a portion of the branch back to a bud or a really small side shoot, which is a heading cut. All right, so what I want to do now is I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of pruning different situations or different types of shrubs or different situations that you would be in with shrubs. So we're going to walk through some of these. I'm going to start with deciduous shrubs. So before I get into kind of different types of or different kind of flowering types and those kinds of things with deciduous shrubs, I do want to talk about the two major forms that we see with deciduous shrubs. Now, not all shrubs fall neatly into these two categories. And so there's always going to be a little bit of interpretation with this, but in general, the two categories that we see are cane type or framework type shrubs. So cane type shrubs are going to be those that produce a lot of relatively unbranched, they may be branched, but most of the stem and most of the stem growth and most of the growth in general comes from the base of the shrub. And these do tend to respond really well to thinning cuts. And when we do heading cuts, it really often destroys the natural shape of the cane type shrubs. So keep that in mind as we go through this. It doesn't mean you can't do a heading cut on these types of shrubs. It just means that they respond in a different way than obviously than a thinning cut. And for many of these shrubs, most of the growth comes from low or the base or the root system of the shrub. And many of the shrubs we're familiar with are these cane types of shrubs. So apart from the ones that you see there on the screen, this would also include things like forsythia and lilac and beauty bush, smooth hydrangea or Annabelle hydrangea would all fit into this category of shrub. And we often prune on these types of shrubs to encourage new growth from the base because that growth has better flowering, better fruiting, or better foliage or stem color. The other type of shrub that we might see are framework type shrubs, and these have more architectural branching. Most of the growth that happens in these shrubs happens from the upper branches, not from the base of the shrub. And what it means is that it often kind of looks a little bit like just a really wide, low tree without a trunk. These shrubs do tend to respond a little bit better to heading cuts because their growth tends to be from branch tips anyway, rather than from the base of the shrub like they are with cane type shrubs. But thinning cuts are also done by just trimming back to the point of origin for that branch and can be beneficial for opening up the shrub and all the things that we've talked about already. Some of the shrubs you might be familiar with that have this form of growth habit, apart from the ones that are on the screen here, include burning bush and panicle hydrangea. So these shrubs, most of their growth is not from the base, although if you did like mow them off, they probably would sprout some from the base. Most of their growth is more within the quote unquote canopy of the shrub. Okay, so we have these two types of shrubs, and typically the timing for pruning really depends on when the shrub flowers. So we'll start with spring blooming deciduous shrubs. These shrubs will set flower buds sometime shortly after they finish blooming, usually in mid to late summer, maybe into fall a little bit. Those flower buds overwinter and then open relatively early the next growing season in the spring. So if we want to preserve as many flowers as possible on spring blooming shrubs, we're going to wait to prune until just after flowering. Now you can prune these shrubs at other times, and sometimes that makes sense to do that. You just may be removing some of the flower buds. And for some of these plants, the flowers are really the reason why we grow it. I mean, lilac's an okay green plant, but we're growing that thing for those beautiful fragrant flowers. And if we're doing something that takes away many of those flowers, what's the point of even having the shrub, right? So making sure that we have as many flowers as possible is something that we want to do with these shrubs typically, and waiting to prune till just after they finish blooming is the best kind of course of action for these. And for many of these plants, that ends up being late May, maybe the first part of June, depending on the shrub. Some other some spring blooming shrubs that you're probably very familiar with, other than the ones that are on the screen, include things like forsythia, many of the viburnums, Weigela, deutzia, most of the viburnums, and bridal wreath spirea. So that is, and most of those kind of bloom April, May, maybe the first part of June. Weigela tends to bloom a little bit later in spring. But they all set their flower buds the season before. Summer blooming shrubs will bloom on current year's growth. And because of that, it means that we can prune, sometimes even prune these back pretty hard and still get flowers. And so for these types of shrubs, pruning in late winter, early spring. So this is any time from kind of early March timeframe through early April, as early as late February, sometimes as late as mid-April. That's kind of the time frame we're looking at. And most of the time, these shrubs will bloom well, even if they're really severely pruned. If we severely prune a spring blooming shrub, we lose a lot of flowers. If we severely prune a summer blooming one, they might flower a little bit later in the season than it would have otherwise, but it tends to still bloom. One of the, so apart from the ones that are there on the screen there, Japanese spirea, potentilla, those two types of hydrangea, these are all really typical summer blooming shrubs that we have in Iowa. I do want to take a kind of a quick little detour and talk a little bit about pruning hydrangea, because this is a group of shrubs that is really popular. And their pruning depends on which type of hydrangea you have. So smooth hydrangea, panicle hydrangea, both bloom on new growth, and they bloom kind of mid to late summer. And so we can prune these shrubs in the late winter, early spring timeframe without any consequence to blooms. Oak leaf hydrangea, which is another type of hydrangea that we'll find in Iowa, they don't tend to need a lot of pruning, but they bloom on previous year's growth. They bloom on old wood. And so if we do a lot of pruning, we'll lose a lot of flowers. So if you need it, and it rarely does need it, but if you need it, you would prune oak leaf hydrangea right after it finishes bloom. The last kind of major type of hydrangea that we see in Iowa gardens is the big leaf hydrangea. So this is the blue or pink kind of ball-shaped hydrangea that is on every third cover of gardening magazines across the country. We love this hydrangea. The traditional big leaf hydrangea blooms on old growth. The issue in Iowa and places further north is that these hydrangeas, big leaf hydrangeas, die to the ground over winter. And so they never have old growth because the old growth is killed every winter. And so we never see flowers. Now, there are varieties of big leaf hydrangea, most notably endless summer, that bloom on both new growth and old growth. This allows us to grow these and get flowers on these plants this far north, which is super exciting. But we're going to prune these a little bit differently so that we don't accidentally get rid of flowers. Most seasons we'll see quite a bit of dieback on big leaf hydrangea, but if we have really good snow cover or a relatively mild winter, they may not die all the way to the ground. So we're going to wait until we see new growth just starting, and we're just going to prune out whatever is dead. And we should get a proliferation of new shoots from the base that will bloom, and then what's left, if there's any left that didn't get winter killed, will also bloom. There are some deciduous shrubs that are grown not primarily for flowers. All of these shrubs have flowers. Some of them are actually pretty nice, but the main purpose for us growing them is not the flowers. The flowers are secondary. And so we're going to treat these a little bit differently so that we can get the most out of its primary purpose, which in most cases is really ornamental foliage. Most shrubs have nicer color on newer growth. And so when we prune these shrubs that we're not trying to get flowers from, late winter, early spring is the best time to do it. We can get that new growth in the spring and get those bright colors. There are some deciduous shrubs that absolutely have very nice showy flowers. So things like burning bush and barberry, the flowers are there. Sometimes the flower on barberry is kind of cute. The one on burning bush isn't really much to write home about. So these we have no problem with, but other shrubs, in particular, things like elderberry, ninebark, and smokebush do have very nice flowers, but they also have many cultivars that have amazing foliage. And for those cultivars, it's often better to focus on and promote the growth of that really nice foliage rather than focusing on the flowers. And so we would treat them much in the same way we would treat something that we don't care about the flowers on. So pruning in late winter, early spring is the best way to go for those particular shrubs to get that new growth that looks nice. Okay, so we talked about deciduous shrubs. I now want to kind of shift gears to evergreen shrubs. We're going to talk about both conifers and broadleaf evergreens here. And especially with conifers, the way we prune these plants looks different. And as a general rule, conifers have much fewer latent and lateral buds. And what that means is that when we prune these plants, they don't regrow very vigorously, if at all. Especially if we do a really poor job of pruning these plants. And that can really lead to some really ugly looking conifers if we're not careful. So because conifers respond differently to pruning cuts than deciduous shrubs, we are going to do a few things a little bit differently. So I want to talk about all the evergreen shrubs. I'm going to start with conifers that have scale-like leaves, so junipers and arborvitae, hemlock. Most of these conifers kind of grow throughout the growing season. They're kind of putting on growth throughout the growing season. And they do behave more like deciduous shrubs than other conifers. And so we can shear and make a bunch of heading cuts on things like arborvitae and juniper, and we see new regrowth when we do that. The big thing to keep in mind is that we cannot prune back into leafless stems on these conifers. The only spot where they have latent or lateral buds that can break after you make a pruning cut to regrow are in the areas that are still green. So when we look at a conifer, the outer part of the branch is going to have several years worth of growth on it, and the leaves don't live forever. They may be on for a couple of growing seasons. On some species, it might be as many as 5 or 6. Most of the time, a leaf will last 2-3 years about and then fall off. And so we see the interior of conifers being leafless. If we prune back in to those leafless areas of the conifer, we'll create a hole, and in most situations, it will always be there because there are no buds, no latent buds, no lateral buds that can break and regrow to fill in that hole that you created. So when you're pruning these plants, make sure that you only prune back into green parts of the stem. And you would probably do that either just before or just after the new growth emerges in the spring. You can do it just about any time of the year. Just don't prune in late summer. So starting about mid to late August to the end of the growing season, you are going to get some regrowth if you do this right. And that new growth is not going to be well hardened off, and it's more likely to see winter damage because of it. Looking at needle-like conifers, these are best pruned. Things like fir, spruce, and pine. They're also conifers that you cannot prune back into dead areas. And so if you make thinning cuts or if you cut back into brown areas of the stem, you're not going to get that regrowth, and you're going to end up with gaps and holes that will not fill in. When we look at fir and spruce, they do have lateral buds in the green parts of the stem, so we can prune those back either just before or just after the new growth comes out. Usually just after is preferred, and only back into green parts, not real severely. For pines, the only part that we can really prune on a pine is the current season's growth. So a new pine, like in that center picture there, you notice they have the new growth. They're called a candle. You can prune back the candle to help maintain a shape, like an emugal pine, for example. We'll wait for the new growth to form and then prune it back to that point. There's one exception to all of this, and that is yews. Yews have needle-like leaves, but yews also have quite a few latent buds and lateral buds. They're almost as much as a lot of deciduous shrubs. And so they do respond pretty well. This is why they make decent shrubs for formal hedges, because we can shear them, and there's lots of latent buds that can break and grow because of that. But again, we don't want to prune too far back into the shrub. While it does have latent buds, if we prune back into brown areas of the stem, they're not going to real vigorously grow back. It's going to take a while for that gap that forms to fill back in. So we do want to avoid it. And with yew, we can prune them just before or just after the new growth forms in early spring. And just like with the other ones, we don't want to prune them in late summer or fall, because that new growth won't overwinter well. And then next spring, we'll have lots of browning. That's very unattractive on the shrub. When we look at broadleaf evergreens, this includes things like boxwood, rhododendrons, holly, inkberry. These plants are best pruned late winter, early spring, just before the new growth starts. Some of them will have winter dieback, and we'll notice that in early spring. So you want to start by removing any brown material. Boxwood in particular can sometimes have really rough winters in Iowa. And so we want to remove the brown material first and then do any kind of shaping. I'm not talking about creating formal hedges. This is just kind of general shaping, general pruning on these broadleaf evergreens. Now I want to talk a little bit about reclaiming big overgrown shrubs. This happens. Sometimes they just get away from us, or we inherit a property that has overgrown shrubs on them. And there are ways to get these neglected plants kind of back in to better blooming, a more reasonable size, nicer looking foliage, healthier plants. There's a couple ways we can approach this. We're going to start with deciduous shrubs. We can do a rejuvenation pruning on deciduous shrubs. And this one is where we're going to go in. We're going to start by removing a third of the oldest branches on the shrub. Many of the cane type shrubs, this would be removing a third of those branches all the way down to the base of the plant. We're going to see some regrowth from the base of the plant. Then the second year, we're going to remove the next third of the largest branches that are there and maybe clean up some of that vigorous regrowth so there isn't quite so much down there. And then the third year, we're going to do the same and remove the final third of the old branches that were there. And by that time, we have replaced and rejuvenated the entire shrub. This is a great way to reclaim large overgrown lilacs, as well as most cane type shrubs that might become too large. We can also do a renewal pruning. This is much more drastic than a rejuvenation pruning. And so not all shrubs are going to respond great to this because it is more stressful on the plant. But this is essentially, you can do this with cane growing, cane type shrubs, and you're just going to, in early winter or spring, and this is when you do the pruning for rejuvenation in early spring, late winter as well. We're going to cut all the stems off 4 to 6 inches above the ground. And it's going to force all this new regrowth that will hopefully have better flowers, better form, be smaller, better leaf color, all of that stuff. On some shrubs, a rejuvenation prune or a renovation or renewal pruning, cutting them all off at the base, may set some flowering back for a couple of years as the shrub recovers. On some, especially those that are summer blooming, they'll respond right away and flower that same year. And certain shrubs do pretty well with this. In particular, the spireas do well with this, barberry, potentilla, flowering quince, smokebush, ninebark. There are quite a few that will respond well to this. The summer blooming ones in general will see blooming relatively soon after we do this drastic pruning. On others, you might lose a season or two, but at least you're kind of reclaiming this big overgrown, kind of usually not very attractive looking shrub. If you have this picture, if you have an overgrown evergreen, in particular an overgrown conifer, often there's not much that can be done to reclaim it. Remember, conifers in particular, pines, spruces, firs, even arborvitae and all of those, they don't have a lot of latent buds, if any, back into the brown or leafless areas of the stem. And to reclaim these shrubs, it certainly means we have to go back into those areas of the shrub. And so we make these cuts, which is what happened here. They tried, they made these cuts back, no regrowth. And you're left with something that just isn't very attractive. So when we have these big gangly conifers that are just too large for an area, most of the time our only option is to either put up with it or remove it and replace it with something smaller. Hopefully it's something that doesn't get as big as that one would. Yews and boxwoods do have a fair amount of latent buds, and so we can prune them back, sometimes relatively hard, but they're going to respond a lot slower to this than deciduous shrubs would. And often it takes so long for those shrubs to recover from that it still makes sense to remove and replace them, especially with yew. Keep that in mind when you're dealing with conifers. In most cases, you're just going to end up replacing these. They're very difficult or impossible to reclaim. Okay, let's talk about formal hedges, because we can't talk about pruning shrubs without talking about making shrubs into meatballs. I find formal hedges, there's a romance and an art behind formal or sheared hedges. They are amazing to look at because of their artistry, because of the work that goes into them, but they come with a lot of work. And you can't do sheared shrubs halfway and be happy with their appearance. So it is really important before you embark on creating sheared shrubs, hedges, meatballs, boxes, teddy bears, whatever you're trying to do. It is really important to understand that it is a big commitment to have a good looking sheared or formal hedge. Because if you do it halfway, it looks terrible. If you decide that's something you want to do, something you have the time to do, then a few things to keep in mind. Basically, shearing is a bunch of heading cuts. So we're going to get a lot of regrowth after we shear a plant. And what that ends up doing is it creates a shrub that has a green shell and a brown interior. And often we want to make sure that we're shearing in such a way that we don't go back into that brown interior, because then we're going to have a gap or a hole. And while some shrubs will be able to recover with that in time, it's not very attractive in the interim. So we want to make sure that we're doing shearing often, and that we're not shearing back into that dead center of the shrub. You also want to have realistic expectations about your shrub. If you need a 2-foot tall hedge, don't use a privet that gets 6 foot tall. You are going to be battling that. That will be a lot of work, even more work than it already is to keep a sheared hedge in your yard. Remember too that there are a lot of shrubs that are relatively tidy and compact growing without shearing. And so if with good plant selection, we can get this look without as much work. Now, we're not going to get the look of that little meatball forest that's there on the left. That can only be done through shearing. But if we want this, on the right-hand side, there is a picture. That is the fanciest chicken coop I have ever encountered. A beautiful property with a beautiful chicken coop. They had a lot of sheared formal hedges, and it was amazing to see, but it is a lot of work. And so those boxwood that are on either side of the door of that chicken coop are sheared on a regular basis to maintain that shape. But the arborvitae that are in kind of the left side of that photo, those grow that way. So those aren't sheared, and they're not as quite as formal and tidy looking as the ones that are sheared, but they certainly are a lot less work. And you can also have a hedge that is not sheared. Sometimes I think we forget this. You can still get the same benefits from a hedge, the green, the backdrop, all of that stuff without shearing it. And there are lots of things that can do that well. Lilac, forsythia, there's quite a few different shrubs. If you are going to maintain a shrub, making sure that it is pyramidal in shape, that doesn't collect a lot of snow where it could break branches. And it's really important that the base is wider than the top so that the entire shrub can get good light and not get thin and spindly at the bottom. If you're going to maintain a formal shrub, there's at least, at minimum, absolute minimum, are 2 prunings. Your primary pruning is going to be in midsummer, after all the new growth is flushed out. This is the one where you're going to make sure all the lines are straight and level and all of that stuff. That one's going to be in midsummer, kind of July-ish, maybe late June, depending on what species it is. And then you'll probably want to do a light kind of cleanup just to kind of keep things from looking too ragged in spring, either just before or just after the new growth comes out. But really, when we're pruning formal hedges, if you want a nice formal hedge, you're going to be pruning at least once a month to get the tidiest of looking hedges. And I love these photos because I don't know anybody who prunes a hedge like 6 times a year and looks that happy. I don't know. I would never be that happy pruning something that frequently. But if that is something that you want, that's the kind of work that goes into it. In reality, for many of us, it starts to feel a little bit like this. She doesn't look like she's enjoying herself. She's also pruning a shrub that has no business being a hedge. It looks like ivory halo dogwood. That would be a terrible hedge. Boxwood, yew, privet, sometimes barberry, some of the lilacs, alpine currant, also do fairly well as formal hedges, but most shrubs do not. Most shrub species don't. And then over time, it starts to feel more like this. And then it's not uncommon for the job to really start to feel like this. We, of course, don't want this. I don't want to say, you probably feel like I'm recommending that you don't maintain a formal hedge. And I kind of am, because for most of us, we do not have the time to adequately maintain a formal hedge. Do I appreciate the artistry and work that goes into a formal hedge? Absolutely. I think it's amazing. But for most of us, it's not practical. So make sure you go into it with eyes wide open, I guess maybe is the best lesson here. Okay, look at my time here. I want to make sure I get through everything. I want to talk a little bit about pruning roses. Roses really do need pruning to improve their appearance. That also helps because it can promote better flowering. You can get better airflow and light penetration, so we can reduce disease that way. And roses often have winter dieback or stem dieback, and we want to remove that too to improve appearance. We're going to talk about a couple different types of roses. The most common roses we find in garden centers today are shrub and landscape roses. These are the knockouts, the easy elegance roses, the buck roses, if you're familiar with those shrub roses that were developed at Iowa State. These roses are sold as low maintenance roses, and their pruning is pretty straightforward too. They will probably have a little bit of winter damage, especially roses like knockout. They often have some winter dieback. So you're going to start by pruning the winter dieback, and that's about it. When it starts to bud out, you'll remove all that dead material. You might open it up a little bit, or if it doesn't have a lot of winter dieback, you might make a few heading cuts to buds that are faced outward to promote some branching and more fullness. But otherwise, That's about all you're going to do. Old-fashioned roses, these are things like the albas, the damasks, the gallicas, the moss roses, those roses that bloom once a year, usually in early summer, and are usually pretty winter hardy. So we don't have a lot of dead material, but you will prune out any dead that you might find in early spring, and then wait to do any major pruning until the flowers are done. Just after the flowers are done is when you would do any major pruning if you had to do that. And in most cases for these old-fashioned roses, the major pruning you're doing is just keeping them in bounds. A lot of them have runners and they spread very readily. And so that's often a lot of the pruning we end up doing. These are the roses that are a lot of work. Hybrid teas, grandiflora, floribunda roses are not winter hardy in Iowa without protection. So that's a bunch of work. And they often need some pretty extensive pruning to bloom well. They'll bloom on current season's growth from early summer, mid-early summer through to fall frost. And we're going to start pruning on these as soon as we remove the winter protection in spring, which for most of us is mid-late March, somewhere in there. We're going to remove anything that is dieback because there is almost always, sometimes quite a bit of winter dieback. So we're going to start by removing all the dead material, and hopefully we get down to about 4 or 5 nice canes. And then we can trim those back to about 24 inches. Hopefully we have buds that are pointed outward, and we can get some pretty nice roses after that. The last group I want to mention are climbing or rambling roses. Climbing is a bit of a misnomer. These roses don't climb, they just flop over things. So rambling is probably a better, more accurate term. They have very long, vigorous shoots that can be supported by trellises or walls or other kind of structures. A lot of them are not, okay, so some of them will bloom on new growth and some of them bloom on old growth. And many climbing roses are not reliably winter hardy in Iowa, but there are a few. William Baffin is a good one that we often use in an Iowa garden. Because of that, we see a lot of winter dieback. So pruning of these roses is going to start in early spring when we see the new growth just starting, and we can identify which canes are dead and which ones are not. We're going to remove all the dead canes, and then we're going to see what's left. And we may make some heading cuts to promote some branching, so that we don't have these big, long, arching canes that just kind of flop over somewhere. And then we'll see a lot of vigorous growth. We might head back some of those really vigorous canes so that we can get some branching and more flowers as a result. So that's kind of how we're going to tackle climbing roses. This is kind of a nice transition to vines. I want to talk real briefly about vines. They're pretty straightforward. Vines are very vigorous growers. And because they are so vigorous and grow so much, they often need pruning to look their best. A lot of times, lots of dead stems can accumulate over time, and it doesn't really look very good. Now, those dead stems cause no problem to the plant. This is about appearance. Most vines can be pruned in late winter, early spring, just before they leaf out, because most of the vines we grow in Iowa bloom on current year's growth. And you can prune them back to kind of like the major canes or major vines. Often that's nice because we don't want to prune them back all the way to the ground and then have to retrain them onto an arbor or a trellis. We just prune them back to kind of like the top of the arbor. That can work really, really well. We can also prune most vines like we would with a renewal pruning on shrubs, all the way back down to the ground. They're such vigorous growers that they can recover from that pretty well. And because they bloom on current year's growth, most of them do, they'll still bloom. Although on some, you may see less of a bloom for the first year or two after that really severe cutback. There are a few vines that don't bloom on current year's growth, that bloom on old wood, namely wisteria and some of the clematis or clematis, however you want to say it. For these, we're going to wait to prune until just after they finish flowering in the spring. Be ready for vigorous regrowth whenever you prune any vine. And some vines, you'll even see suckering and stuff coming up from the root system. This is particularly true for trumpet creeper. So keep that in mind when you're tackling these vines. And the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap things up here today is the queen of vines, the clematis or clematis. This is a really large, diverse group of plants. And they have beautiful, wonderful, colorful flowers, often very large, often very fragrant. And they grow in different ways, which can make pruning kind of intimidating for these vines. We can put clematis into three major groups. And the first group I want to talk about are those that bloom on current year's growth. And most of the clematis that we grow in Iowa fall into this group. This is Jackmanii. This is sweet autumn clematis. And for these varieties, they tend to produce one large flush of bloom late spring, maybe even later into the season. Summer, early summer, that kind of time frame. And for these, we can prune them back within 6 to 12 inches of the ground, especially the really vigorous growers like sweet autumn clematis. And they will grow up and we can get rid of all that dead material. We can kind of keep them in check in terms of size, and they'll still bloom that year. There are other clematis that bloom on previous year's growth. They bloom on old growth, and these tend to bloom very early in the season, usually in May. If we prune them back hard, we'll get very poor, if any, bloom. So for these plants, we're gonna start until the vines start to leaf out, and we'll try to prune out any of the dead material, kind of carefully prune and pull out the dead material. And then if we need to do any pruning beyond that, we'll do it just as soon as they finish flowering in the spring. We can also prune these back really hard after they're done flowering. If it's a really vigorous grower, we can prune it back nearly to the ground. If it's not such a vigorous grower, we might only cut it back by a third or a half to help reduce the size. The last group are those that bloom on both new and old growth. They tend to bloom twice a year, earlier in the season on the previous season's growth, later in the season on the new growth. And sometimes these are the hardest to figure out. We can approach these a couple of different ways. We can treat these like the ones that bloom on old growth and get in there in spring, prune out any of the dead stuff, wait for them to bloom in spring, and then prune after that. But we sacrifice the second bloom when we prune them that way. We can also prune them like the first group, like the Jackmanii and sweet autumn, and prune them hard in the spring. But we sacrifice that first round of bloom when we do that. They'll bloom later, of course, but we won't get that first round of bloom when we do that. One of the ways that you can kind of get the best of both worlds with this particular group of clematis or clematis is to cut them back about halfway every other year. And so every other year, you'll have a wonderful show. And on the years you cut them back, you'll have a reduced flower kind of display. Feels like a lot, doesn't it? The thing I want to make sure that you understand, though, is that clematis will grow and bloom without pruning. You don't have to prune it. They often look a little better because there's not so many twigs and stems and dead things there, but it'll bloom and grow even without pruning. And when in doubt, you can prune it back to the ground, and many of them will still bloom. And if they were in that second group that only blooms on the old growth, then you know better next time. You'll lose bloom that one season, but then you'll know better and you won't do that again. So those are some of your options when it comes to these vines. And I know that sometimes feels a little overwhelming, but again, you don't have to prune them. They'll still bloom and grow. So a lot of the information I just talked about is in a lot more detail on the Horticulture and Home Pest News website. This is full of gardening information for Iowa. It's a great resource if you want to use it. The website's there on the screen. Hopefully you have an idea now of how to tackle some of the pruning projects in your landscape. And we're getting right into the season where it's the perfect time to do much of it. So hopefully that has been really helpful. I know